Many of Boston's community centers are located in school buildings, and they have a long history of educational programming. But during the pandemic, that was taken to a much higher level thanks to programming help from partner agencies and a technological boost from Comcast. To tell us about the efforts are the Director of Community Impact for Comcast Greater Boston Region, Becca Fracassa, and the Commissioner of Boston Centers for Youth and Families, Will Morales. I'd like to thank you both very much for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
I want to start with Will. If we wind back to a bit more than a year ago, the schools shut down, parents and kids are going crazy with remote learning, and somebody comes to you, can you help with this? What kind of needs were you having to meet at that point?
Oh, I mean, a year ago feels like a long time ago, but it wasn't. It was really short. I think when people started coming to us, they expected us to really be sort of the forefront department or agency that might be able to pull something off. And so there was a lot of expectations set on us, not only by city administrations or by our partners, but really by the families themselves, who have always counted on us day in and day out to deliver programming to the best of our abilities. We still had families that needed to get to work, needed to go somewhere, needed to do something. And so they needed a place that they found that it was a consistent caring place for their children. And so we quickly began to work with the city's administration, the Boston Public Health Commission, and other partners to think about what are the right protocols that we could put in place that provide the right amount of safeguards that allow us to do safe programming. And so with that, we began to expand about what we can do and how we can do it. And one of the things that, of course, was limiting us at that time was our inability to have an expanded sort of Wi-Fi connection throughout all our facilities. Really, they were limited to one rooms, and sometimes that further hindered us from doing what we had to do. But great thing that we have a great partnership with Comcast, and they saw that gap and saw that and really made it available for us to kind of close that gap and allow us to continue not only to run some programming, but even to expand on it in a new way that we didn't expect for it to happen if the pandemic didn't happen. And what it did, it really got our reach further out there to our families, especially to our youth, and allow us to continue to run a modified schedule of our programming, not the way that we wanted to, but at least something that began to address the needs that the parents were asking of us.
Becca, what people were up against was, in some cases, people at home, more people than normal, trying to feed off the same amount of bandwidth, sometimes trying to do, learning on cell phones, and things were getting bogged down. How does supercharged Wi-Fi at a community center change that?
Sure. It allows folks to have access in a place outside of the home for folks that may be challenged, whether it's housing insecurity or any number of other reasons. We can put this supercharged Wi-Fi in a community center in a safe space that they're comfortable with so that they can have access to things like remote learning, online banking, job search, any of those tools that can really help them move forward with their lives, especially in this tough situation.
So what did you have to do to make this work at all these locations? Because we're talking at least with about 18 Boston, community center locations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We've connected 25 thus far. We've got another 2 to go. We're very excited to do it. An exceptionally dedicated team of technicians that serve our Boston market. Quite frankly, a technical supervisor would go out and look at each and every one of these sites, determine what was necessary, place the necessary access points, get a day or two's worth of work in to really build those connections before we could make that ready and available to the folks that we're serving.
Well, what about making this safe for people to use? Because you're not just opening a door and telling people to plug in and start doing their homework. I mean, you got to make sure there's enough distance. You have to make sure that they know how to use the machines that they're having at their disposal. How did that come together?
Well, but the great thing about it is, like I mentioned earlier, we were greatly reduced in where we can actually run programming that had Wi-Fi capacity, right? Because we just didn't have the infrastructure put in place that every room, the gymnasium, even some exterior spaces outside some of our locations that might have picnic tables, didn't have the Wi-Fi reach. with the Comcast Lift Zone, we have that reach now. Now we're able now to basically bring people in, break them out in different spaces, and they have the same Wi-Fi connectivity to be a part of whatever programming we might be doing online, or giving them the connectedness so that they can continue to do what they have to do. As Becca just mentioned, you had families that were coming in that were dramatically impacted because their livelihood changed, right? Especially if they worked in the service industry, if they were working in restaurants, if they were working in hotels, right? They were furloughed, and now they knew that they wanted to reapply for jobs, but then they're realizing now in the workplace, it's very rare that you pull out the pen and paper for an application. Everything has to happen online. So we had to find some dedicated spaces where parents can actually sit, dedicate some computers, or dedicate the opportunities that they can even use their own iPads from home and basically be able to run through that process, work with our staff if they had any clarifying questions and so forth. But the fact that we would be able to be supercharged means that now our Wi-Fi connectivity wasn't just at the computer lab, which was one room. Now it could happen in our gymnasiums, it could happen in our arts and crafts spaces, it could happen outside our doors, in some of our open spaces. It just allowed us to meet some safe distancing measures while still providing people the opportunities to come in, use the connectivity in a safe space with the safe numbers around them to do so.
Becca, what about what's going to be continuing from this? I know a lot of things are going back to normal, but there's a lot of summer work that students need to do to catch up on things, and who knows, even a new normal might include more work at community centers with Wi-Fi access. What's going to be happening going forward?
Sure. So this is a 3-year commitment. We understand that this digital gap was something that was exacerbated throughout the pandemic environment. However, it was certainly not something that was new. So we have made a commitment for at least 3 years moving forward to continue to provide lift zones with community partners throughout the country, quite frankly, wherever Comcast offers service.
Well, what do you see as at least some of the possible potential here for community centers during the summer with some of these new demands for learning and other kinds of service?
Oh, I think what it would do is it'll allow us to expand a little bit more our programming. It'll allow us to connect with individuals who sometimes don't have the time to come in physically into our spaces, and using technology like Zoom and so forth, we can connect the Chris Lovitz to our kids, right? And to understand what does it mean to have a career in journalism that wasn't there. What it will allow us to also do is begin to hopefully close even the biggest gap that exists among our senior population, our active older adults who sometimes have the smartphones and don't know how to really use them. But because of the fact that we didn't have the connectivity that at the level that we have, we couldn't really run some educational introductory classes on how they can use those smartphones to stay connected with their families. Because as you know, seniors were the ones that also were highly really impacted through the pandemic, not only if they had contracted COVID, but most importantly, the isolation that came with it was another detrimental aspect to their work. So we see a whole array of opportunities, but we also see opportunities and where we can expand their minds a little bit to think about being very much more creative and looking at possible careers in the engineering field, right? Which we know that it seems to be the new market of growth for individuals if they really want to get into a more lucrative career that hopefully will pay some high dividends back to them as young adults. We want to see how we can expand those aspects and to see how we can even push it even further. One thing that we did learn during the pandemic is that we learned how much we needed technology. Now we have to think about how do we expand that technology to not only continue to stay engaged with our families, but to really provide them with new opportunities in a very new way.
By the way, Will, those learning pods that were happening, these groups of students who
Yep.
were somehow joined together, and I think they were gaining in technological literacy too. I mean, this wasn't just a stopgap measure.
No, it wasn't. You're right. The learning pods, we attempted to try to do them in some of our sites. Unfortunately, BPS took a very different angle, but we learned that what we learned from our partners is that those learning pods began to really see how much of a digital fish these children are, how much they really were savvy in using the technology. And if they had additional more tools, how much they're willing to expand their learning around that area, So, there were great opportunities to introduce them into coding and to different aspects of computer science that sometimes you just didn't have before because of the lack of connectivity or the lack of access of terminals or tools or whatever else you may needed to connect them to it. So we're very much interested in sort of being a part of that. I know that in the year that we're coming up, especially this summer, we're going to be looking at where have the gaps in their learning been depreciated, and how do we support it. So if kids struggle through math throughout their calendar year with remote, we're going to look at how we might be able to supplement that, support it. We're looking at trying to bring in college students in to start thinking about providing some tutorial. Some might happen in person, some might happen remotely, just to hopefully get them to be caught up again. And, you know, as a father of 5, I even saw the summer loss happening in my own home with my own children, just because it was a different aspect where I have children that my own children who will gravitate quickly to the technology aspect of it and love the remote learning. But when you have younger ones who definitely need the in-person, you know, and that in-person doesn't happen, then there's going to be a loss that's going to take place that needs to be recovered somewhere. And BCOF wants to be part of that recovery. Since we're no longer in response, we're now in recovery.
Becca, what I'm hearing about here is something made possible by businesses chipping in and being a good neighbor during a hard time. But on the other hand, this also sounds like a growth opportunity, at least going down the road.
Absolutely, it's a growth opportunity. I think one of the things that we've done as an organization, and we've committed, by the way, over the next 10 years, another $1 billion in investment to digital equity issues across the board on behalf of Internet Essentials and the Lift Zones programs as we're moving forward. However, whenever we're reaching out to improve education, we're reaching out to improve economic development and economic security for individuals, we're creating a better business environment.
I also want to ask you about one other thing here that's also very important just now, the emergency broadband relief. I know some people are aware of this, but some are not. So tell us about that.
Absolutely. The emergency broadband benefit is offering underserved Americans, those that qualify for public assistance, the opportunity to have their bills supported in terms of $50 a month in payments supported by the government for broadband services. Comcast is participating in the emergency broadband benefit, not only with Internet Essentials, but throughout our suite of products. Folks can certainly call in to us to find information, xfinity.com/EBB2, if you do happen to have internet access. It's a fantastic opportunity to learn more how you can take advantage of this subsidy for broadband access.
And in the same context, we should mention you've been doing some work on the hotspots where people can get free access. Can you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Absolutely. In March of last year, we opened our hotspots across the board to folks that in general, so that any of those public hotspots that exist that were previously available only to Xfinity customers are now available to the public in general throughout our businesses, and sometimes external hotspots as well are available for folks to utilize in the pandemic environment, and that will continue through the end of 2021.
I'd like to thank you both very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
for having us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. That was Becca Fracassa from Comcast and Will Morales from Boston Centers for Youth and Families. We'll have more news in just a moment.